Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this press conference at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm Anthony Rowley, First Vice President, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who's very well known at this club to all of you, I'm sure, Mr. Jesper Koll, who is the Chief Executive Officer of WisdomTree Japan. He is, I say, very well known at this club. He's a long-standing financial authority in Japan. Before he joined WisdomTree, he was for 2 decades with investment banks, with JP Morgan and with Merrill Lynch as Director of Research and Chief Strategist. Jesper has also served on various government panels in Japan, official advisory committees, and in other capacities. But he is very well known, and you do have a brief summary of his career here, so I won't take up any more time on that. He's going to talk about the cost of restructuring North Korea and who pays. The timing couldn't be more propitious, really. As you know, President Trump and Mr. Kim met this morning in Singapore. They didn't walk out of the meeting in the first minute, which was good. According to Mr. Trump, they've signed a very comprehensive agreement. We don't know what's in it yet, and the relationship, according to Trump, is great. So things are moving forward, and now we come to the part where, at least quite soon, money is likely to have to change hands to finance the reconstruction of North Korea, and Jesper is going to address that subject. So please join me in welcoming him to the club.
Great. Thank you very much for this kind introduction here. I'm very glad that you are not watching Mr. Trump live on TV, but are taking the time to listen to some facts, not fake news here. It's interesting. I mean, as you know, I'm a Japan guy. I've been stuck here since 1985. And my private email is jesper@japanoptimist.com. So I'm always optimistic on Japan. I think it's the greatest place on earth. And my interest in North Korea really started almost exactly 10 years ago when the chief investment officer of Japan's largest private pension fund, when we were having a drink in the evening, and he said, well, Jesper, quite frankly, the only reason I could get bullish on Japan is if North Korea, starts to develop. Because North Korea has got exactly what Japan does not have, and vice versa. They're very, very complementary. North Korea has a lot of people, but no savings, no technology. Japan obviously has got a lot of technology and a lot of savings. So, this could be, something interesting. And, obviously now you can debate the politics, you can debate the security. It's all very, very complicated. But I think, it's a reasonable assumption that, this time is different, and that the new regime in North Korea, or the relatively new regime in North Korea, actually, is interested in modernizing, is interested in solidifying the family's power base by, upgrading, by modernizing North Korea. And so, from an economist perspective, from an analyst perspective, let's have a look at, some of the numbers that are involved there and use the East German and West German, example to sort of set some benchmarks here. And, just, a couple of things out front. We'll just talk about numbers. The West German economy in the last year before unification, the dollar value of West Germany's GDP was about 1.4 trillion US dollars, which somewhat ironically is basically the level that South Korea's GDP is today. Right? So actually the comparison, starting point, $1.4 trillion, is pretty similar. Now, the good news is, of course, that the West German and East German experience, we now have got some numbers, what did actually happen. And it's very straightforward. In the first decade, in the first 10 years, of East and West, of a united Germany, there were $2.5 to $3 trillion of investment opportunities created. So $2.5 to $3 trillion of private investment, whether that was building factories, whether that was building houses, whether that was building sports stadia, right? 2.5 to 3 trillion, which is basically 2 times of West Germany's GDP, but there were also costs. There were a lot of public support, a lot of subsidies from West Germany to East Germany, and those amounted over the first 10 years to somewhere between 1.5 to 2 trillion US dollars. So an opportunity of 2.5 to 3, and a cost, so to speak, a tax on West Germany to the extent of 1.5 to 2 trillion dollars over the first decade. And what did that get East Germany? At the starting point, when the wall came down, basically living standards or per capita GDP, East Germany was about 40%, 40, of West Germany. And 10 years into $3 trillion of private investment, $2 trillion of public support later, the GDP per capita was basically at 80%. Right? So that's sort of the parameters that you had there. It's quite interesting, just as an aside, for the investment opportunity of the private investment, 80% of the money went into the East in the first 5 years. So you obviously have got a big, investment boom right at the beginning, and then, things sort of cater off. So I think, that's something where I think, there is a lesson here for potentially for North Korea here, right? Very interesting, when you look at where did the investment come from, you remember that the East German assets, the state assets, were put into a trust, the Treuhand, which then privatized. And basically of the service part that was privatized, basically 90% went to East Germans. Right? And it was very interesting. East Germans, you remember, had been given a big boost to their purchasing power by the 1-to-1 East mark, West mark currency conversion. Right? So of the service industry, basically about 80–85% went to East Germans. Of the industrial asset, 74% went to West Germans, 20% to East Germans, and only 6% went to non-Germans, right? So effectively, for all intents and purposes, the unification, East and West Germany, was a German affair. The rest of the world, in terms of money flows, in terms of participating, in the Eastern boom, there may have been a lot of talk, but there really wasn't much sort of flow coming through here. Now, that's sort of the numbers in terms of where we are. As I said, you need 2 times of West German's GDP in terms of private investment, plus 1 time of GDP of public support to get per capita GDP, to get living standards from 40% to 80% over 10 years. That's the opportunity that's there. Now, the difference between East and West Germany, I mean, it's literally, where do I start? Right? I mean, first, if you look at the population, right? It took 4 West Germans to support 1 East German, right? As you know, the ratio in between the North and the South of Korea is basically 2-to-1, right? So it's double the burden, so to speak, right? On South Korea. The second big difference, of course, is living standards. GDP per capita, I mentioned, East-West. The East was 40% of West Germany. Now, Andrew, where are North Korean living standards? It's funny. I mean, if you look at the literature there, the numbers vary from basically $750 per capita GDP up to $1,500 per capita GDP. Now, South Korea basically, as you know, is about 30,000, per capita, right? So for all intents and purposes, South Korea is 20 times as rich as the North is. So I came across one fun statistic. You will appreciate that. Germans, remember the East Germans? They were the stars. They were the superstars. They were the LeBron James, right, of the socialist economies, right? 55% of East German households had a car. Now, it was a bit of a joke of a car, right? But still, they did have a car. There was infrastructure, right? 98% of East Germans had a bank account, right? I mean, 5% of the East German economy was actually capitalist in the sense of that the assets or the shops were actually owned, by private entrepreneurs, right? Again, I'm not a North Korea expert. Obviously the whole infrastructure and the use, right, of modern technology, is very, very different, right? So that's sort of where you are in terms of the big numbers. Now, if you build a simple sort of growth model, what is the opportunity and what is the cost? Basically, if you use the East-West German dynamics as a parameter, as a base parameter, to get North Korean per capita GDP from the current $1,000 to $5,000, you basically would need $5 to $6 trillion of private investment, and you would probably need an additional $3 to $4 trillion of public support. Right? So that would be basically 4 times South Korea's GDP in terms of private opportunity, and it would be 2 times, South Korean GDP over a decade, right? In terms of the actual cost, right? Remember, as an aside, in West Germany, income taxes went up by 6.5%, in order to finance part of the support that was given to East Germany at the time. You may also note that in terms of the human evolvement, right, East Germany in the first 3 years of unification lost 11% of its people. They went to the West because, of the prospects of a better life coming through. The public support from West Germany to East Germany was, really very, very incredible. In the first year of unification, East Germany's GDP dropped by 40%, and transfers and subsidies from West Germany accounted for 5.5% of West Germany's GDP, but accounted for 2/3 of all of East Germany's GDP. So despite all this support, still you had 11% of the workforce, 11% of the people, packing their bags from the East and actually leaving. Now, I don't think you want to contemplate, if 10% of 25 million North Koreans pack up their bags and leave and arrive in Tottori, right? Anyway, I mean, but it's just, in terms of, you need to think about sort of some of these parameters, that you actually have. So, again, from $1,000 per capita to $5,000, 6 trillion yen of private investment, 4 trillion yen of public support. South Korea simply doesn't have the income, doesn't have the savings to do this, right? Now, this is where it gets interesting, because while the German unification was a basic Germans-only affair, the modernization of North Korea is very likely to be much more of an international affair, right? As you know, South Korea's GDP, $1.4 trillion. China's GDP is $11.2 trillion. Japan is basically $5 trillion. And then of course you've got the US with 18.6 trillion. So, if you bundle the opportunity together, it would get definitely feasible. And the big question, obviously is going to be what type of model of development North Korea is actually going to be following. And this is where it gets very, very interesting. Because clearly the successful track records of fast-track economic development are the Japanese, the South Korean, and of course the Chinese one. I mean, please remember, China started its special economic zones in 1980. Shenzhen was the first special economic zone. In 1980, Shenzhen had per capita GDP of $450. Today, it has $27,000 per capita GDP. Shenzhen in 1980 was a sleepy village of 30,000 inhabitants. Today, it is basically 10 million people. Right? And that's, a very, very successful model where obviously I think, the China-led modernization of North Korea, I think that from my personal perspective, seems something that, is very, very likely indeed. The question politically, do the North Koreans trust the Chinese to spearhead, the development there? Or, do you need a buffer? And in my personal opinion, I would hope that Japan actually can become that sort of buffer going forward, in the modernization of North Korea. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. There's, obviously lots more details and interesting things to be discussed here. But, in summary, I think that, when you step back, clearly we will all feel much better about the prospects for lasting peace if and when the first concrete joint development progress and projects are actually starting to come through, right? So we shall see how quickly that's going to become. In my personal opinion, I'm hopeful that it's going to be very, very quickly, and I do think that the modernization of North Korea is going to be one of the great investment opportunities that we've actually got going here in Asia Pacific. To put things, by the way, a little bit into perspective, I mentioned $6 trillion of private investment over 10 years. The Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative basically stipulates about $900 billion, right, per annum. So, you're basically on a similar sort of scale in terms of the investment opportunities that that is actually coming through. So let me stop here and, open it up for any questions or comments or concerns. Thank you.
Very much. You covered an enormous amount of ground very quickly. By the way, Jesper did write in the Japan Times last week a piece which contains many of the figures which you probably were unable to keep track of while he was speaking rather rapidly. We do have...
It's what we do in Germany to win the World Cup.
Yes, well, your tactics were very impressive. Okay, but the copies of that, I'm sure we can get run-off copies in the library downstairs, unless you have copies of that article with you. You don't. Anyway, fascinating. A great investment opportunity, you say. Well, that's right. It almost sounds as though there might be a scramble now by everyone to get in first, but what is likely to happen? In fact, I mean, South Korea will be a conduit, presumably, for a lot of foreign money that wants to go into North Korea. The South Koreans themselves already have 2 industrial zones, and I'm told they're likely to build far more. So investing in South Korean companies that will invest in North Korea may be one way of getting in on the act. Sorry, what I'm trying to say is, how will the funds go in? They'll go in under bilateral channels, through bilateral channels initially.
This is very interesting, right? And this is obviously, where, we're standing, and Isun Sakiwayami, right? So 3 inches ahead, there is darkness, right? Hopefully there'll be some light, coming too. What is the model of economic development? Again, so far the development has gone, on basically bilateral initiatives, right? Sanctioned by the Americans and the Chinese between South and North Korea. I do not think that that is likely going forward, right? I think that South Korea is going to play a part of that. It's going to play, potentially an important part of it. But I do think that given the character of Mr. Trump and the character of, Chinese President Xi, I think that it will be much, much more direct, and that, the spoils, so to speak, or the opportunities, right, going to, the United States and or the People's Republic of China. I think that that's really where the thrust of development is going to be coming from. South Korea simply doesn't have the capacity, on the assumption, right, that Mr. Kim needs to fast track the modernization, right? Because if the ability to sit at the table with the big guys because of the nuclear threat, if that goes away, how do I keep my people happy? I've got to have fast-track development, exactly in the same way that China did under Deng, right, in the early 1980s.
Okay, well, let's take questions first from the working press. Yes,
Patrick Walter, Frankfurter Allgemeine. Thanks, Jesper. I have 3 questions, if I may. First, there was the debate, is Mr. Kim, is he becoming Mr. Gorbachev or is he becoming Mr. Deng? Yep. So is he going to be chased out of office if we see economic development and people getting richer in North Korea, or is he going to stay in office? Yep. Would like to get your opinion on that. Second question, if you talk to South Koreans, they definitely have the idea that the whole process of potential unification or economic development of the North is going very much step by step, and that this won't be some kind of radical development as it happened in East Germany or in Germany. So what is your perspective on that? Is there any chance that this is going to step by step over several years, or will we see some kind of breakdown unification? And the third question, looking at the foreign investments we have seen in North Korea until now. Look at Orascom, for example, that built up the mobile net in North Korea. I mean, at one point in time, after several years, they all got confiscated by the state. So how do you think that North Korea is able to overcome that mistrust that obviously exists against investment in North Korea?
Excellent. So first, I think that, and this is, just me hypothesizing, right? As I said, I'm an economist. I'm a Japan guy. I know very little about Korea, but. My hypothesis is that he's going to turn, that he's not a Gorbachev, right? That the whole point of the game is, to have the next step. How do I get my family to run the country for the next 100 years? And the way to do that is by having fast-track economic development. And there's a huge opportunity because in the past, any form of economic development, before Trump, any form of economic development, you would have had huge discussions about, for example, the eco-friendliness of the developments, the human rights aspects of the developments. For all intents and purposes, Mr. Trump, doesn't care about these sort of stuff. He just cares about making a quick buck. Right? But I think for North Korea itself, how after 70 years, after 70 years of solidifying power, right? How do I get to the next stage, right? I think that it is this top-down, and that's why the Chinese economic development model is so very, very attractive, because it's top-down with these special economic zones. You've got oligarchs, right, in the special economic zones, as we all know from doing business with them, right? That, I think, is the model to go forward. Step by step or fast track, right? I think the South Koreans do not see what is coming. I think, that it's going to be a very fast-track development, right? And again, because Mr. Kim and Mr. Kim's family's survival depends on fast and early success. And finally, North Korea, yes, you are absolutely right, and this is the great gray zone. What governance? What recourse, what role will the Asian Development Bank, if any, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, China-led, what will they play in terms of ensuring that there is proper governance, right? We shall see.
Okay, it's interesting in that context that a couple of weeks ago, the chairman of the president of the ADB flew into Seoul and talked to President Moon there. I'm sure the big subject on the table was, the refinancing of the North. By the way, the AIIB, as I'm sure you know, the North Korea did apply for membership of the AIIB, but they were refused. I was told this by the president of the AIIB because they refused to give enough information required. But I'm sure they have an incentive now to give more information. But okay.
Can I make one other comment?
Sure.
Sorry, which I forgot in the presentation. East and West Germany, like I mentioned, East Germany was the superstar, right, of the socialist economies. That also meant, I mean, it wasn't just East Germany that broke open, but the whole of East, Czechoslovakia, Poland, became available for investment. So this caused a big problem for German companies, right? Because yes, I should be building a factory in the United States. I'm sorry. No more factories in America. No, I should be building a factory in the East, right? And I will get some subsidies here, but actually investing in Czechoslovakia, investing in Poland. I mentioned East Germany was 40% of West German GDP. Poland was 8%. Czechoslovakia was 15%. So East Germany was not the low-cost provider. And of course, East Germany, outside of basically some timber and a little bit of coal, has no natural resources. Now, North Korea does have natural resources. And North Korea definitely is the lowest cost provider in Asia Pacific. I mean, you know, Japanese textile companies like fast retailing, you know, if you can trust the contracts that you write, I think are going to be very, very fast, you know, to move into North Korea, because North Korea, in terms of the labor cost, you can actually give Bangladesh a run for its money. Sorry, I just wanted to say.
No, that's fine. Okay, next question, please. If no more questions from the working press, then anyone else is. Yes, please.
Richard Susilo from Indonesia. We know that there is a special economic zone between the border between South and North Korea. Have you analyzed the impact of this very small example, cooperation between two countries? Have you analyzed about this?
No, and the answer is, and I also think that it will be a futile exercise to learn anything about the future. I think that the future is going to be a radical break from what we've seen, you know, from what we've seen in the past. Like I said, I think that, you know, the source of the radicalism, right, is that, you know, the great, is he the great leader, the blessed leader, the dear leader, the great, what, that the leader of North Korea, you know, his survival depends on making this work and making it work very fast.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Oh, it's me again. If you talk to South Korean economists who know quite a lot about North Korea, they argue if Kim is going to start economic development, he will be chased out of office and he won't be able to your argument is he needs a fast-track development to keep in office. This is completely diametrical. I would like to you to comment on that. And second question, even if you start this fast-track development, what do you think is going to happen with the internal border? Is this going to be open for north-south migration? And if not, how can you keep that border? I mean, does the South Koreans keep their military there to keep 25 million out from coming to the south?
I mean, to be blunt on the second question, I think that, you know, the border is going to continue to stay, right? That there is effectively not going to be unification, right? In the sense that in Germany there was no question that East Germany would take the German legal system, the German medical system, the German money system, the German, you know, there was absolutely no question. I think this is a completely different scenario. And as I said, everybody is aware of the potential threat. I mean, if even in East Germany, 11% of the people left, despite these massive subsidies and despite the relative fast and smooth development that happened, right? You know, the risk of, you know, North Korean boat people, right, flooding, you know, Asian economies, and particularly the South Korean economy, I think that risk is very high, right? The fast track one, I think, is more interesting and more predictable and more calculable, right? How quickly do I share the spoils, right? You could have made the same argument against the opening and the fast tracking of the development that happened in the People's Republic of China. Right? In fact, it was very dangerous, right, for the survival of the Communist Party, and there were a lot of people, who were opposed to the modernization. And of course, we in the West, we all thought that the moment you open the window, it's not just flies coming in, which was the great phase by Mr. Deng, right? But that sooner or later you're going to have a liberal democracy, and everything is going to be looking like America. Well, we know 40 years later that exactly the opposite has happened. Right? We've got modernization. We've got one of the most successful economic development models, right, in economic history, right, in the People's Republic of China, right? Yet the grip of power of the Communist Party has actually, grown stronger, and most recently has become more like the North Korean one, right? Since now Mr. Xi is going to be in power for life, right? So I think, that's. Again, you look at this, you see the data is completely different. The amount of money that is required is completely different, right? And you've got something else. I've got a very, very successful economic model, both in terms of economic development and assuring that me and my comrades stay in power, right? It's not a democracy. It's an oligopoly, oligarchy, led by one family.
One of the big barriers appears to have gone. I mean, anything can happen, of course, but it does look as though some sort of treaty will be signed, a peace treaty of some sort between the United States and Korea, which is a tremendous step in itself, but there's still enormous barriers to business going into North Korea. So what are the steps, as you see it, that are absolutely essential before businessmen will contemplate investments in North Korea?
Yeah, good. I think ironically, I think that the concrete steps that you need to have is you do need to have a couple of new economic zones being set up, right, with the rules, regulatory, and legal framework, right, guaranteed, either by the ADB, by the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, right, or by some sort of new fund, that could be set up there, right? That would be, I think, the most important thing to actually get us going there.
Yeah.
The other thing, that is going to be very, very interesting. If sometimes you say, fine. So which business, as an investor, which sector do you invest in, right? And I believe, and this is where America has a competitive advantage over the People's Republic of China, because what is America's largest export? It's food, right? Because if this is fast-tracking development, the best way to bribe the people, so to speak, right, is to ensure that you actually have better food on your table. So I think that the American food multinational companies, they're going to be the #1 round, a winner on that. Right, and that's pretty easy because you import it, right? You don't have to, I mean, eventually then you want to train up and exploit some of the arable land there, but initially, right, it becomes an immediate win, right, in terms of creating exports for the United States of America, where America actually is undisputedly one of the best producers in the world.
Okay, more questions? Yes.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. What kind of role will play the United States in the process? I think Mr. Trump is not a guy who is interested to invest in a country like North Korea, but it means this will weaken the United States' role in Asia further.
This is the key point, right? I think that making a quick buck by creating whatever it is, $3 billion, creating X billion dollars of additional food exports, right? That works very well in a Trump-style campaign, right? But the actual planning, the actual execution, the actual governance, right? That is where the People's Republic of China, I do think, comes in. Right? I do think that you're quite right. I'm very concerned that in the sort of more strategic view of things, right? whether it's One Belt, One Road, whether it's your own economic history of successful development in the People's Republic of China, right? Chinese-style modernization, right? I think that's going to be the big topic, as opposed to, right, American-style development, which is, quite frankly, so far what we've seen in Asia-Pacific outside the People's Republic of China. Right? So you're quite right. I mean, the potential for the Americans to have the great moment on stage right now, but to actually phase out, right, as, you know, the economic development, you know, starts to get going, I think that risk is very, very high, which is why I personally would, why I'm personally urging the Japanese government, right, to get more involved right from the get-go. Right, as sort of the West's ambassador, right, in this development.
Anyone else before you? Oh, yes, there's a hand raised over there. Yes.
My name is Kyoko Hasegawa, working with AFP. My question is about lots of North Korean experts here comment recently that the Japanese economic investment or aid to North Korea can be, in the future, can be a diplomatic card. But I don't see here if China is so involved in North Korean investment.
Well, look, I mean, you know, Japan has the perennial choice, right? I mean, do you want to be active or do you want to be reactive? Right? You know, I mean, you know, there's, you know, if you think about the normalization of North Korea, there's some very real issues, right, with Japan. I mean, you know, Prime Minister Abe continues to, you know, to insist on the abduction issue as something that's very important, right? And, you know, if there were to be, you know, some additional progress, pretty soon you're going to start to talk about reparation issues, right? These are important issues from a social and political and naibuseiji, right? Domestic perspective, you know, but in the scheme of things, you know, is there a risk that Japan is going to miss the boat? I think the answer is yes.
Why do you think that China is such a big model for North Korea, seeing that North Korea has such a history of claiming its independence, its economic independence? It's unified with South Korea already in a deep distrust against China, because if you look at the history, China was always claiming South Korean peninsula as our influence area. And the same goes towards Japan. I mean, if you look what happened this weekend, there was planned to be a unified judo competition team in Ulaanbaatar, and the North Korea said this is not going to happen because we are not going to march into the stadium under the Korean flag that does not show Dokdo. Right. So I mean, you have a deep distrust in North Korea against Japan, especially if you look at the KCNA. The media over the last weeks. I mean, why should they accept Japanese money?
No, it's fine. And that's where, to your first point, right? The model, whether we like it or not, of the People's Republic of China in terms of ensuring, right, a one-party rule in perpetuity despite fast-track economic development, right? This is the model that works. Everybody else got ousted. I mean, like you said, Gorbachev, right? So what model, if I have to follow a model, what model would I follow? This is the one that, for me personally, for my family, right, for my personal ambition, you know, provides the greatest guarantees. Well, everything else, you know, basically ended up failing, right? Now, the distrust, yes, is very deep, right? And there is lots of work, you know, that needs to be done there.
For South Korea, surely this provides an enormous opportunity for the chaebols, for instance. In North Korea, as you say, is a very low, you know, on a scale with Bangladesh, for example. So the opportunity for South Korean industrialists to capitalize on having some greater degree of cooperation with the North is surely huge. I mean, doesn't this imply that Korea, as a eventually unified nation, has an opportunity here to become far more powerful than it is at the moment by virtue of
if you believe if you believe that you can actually, do, one country, two systems, right? I mean, the whole prerogative is that, that Mr. Kim in the north, right, wants to preserve himself on his terms. So he will not adopt the won as the currency. He will not adopt the Korean legal system. The South Korean unions will not have a say in any of the development, right? They stay effectively two countries.
But does that prevent South Korean investment in?
No, there'll be some. I mean, look, South Korea makes turbines, right? There's a need for turbines, right? So, it'll be part of it. But is this led by South Korea? I think the answer is no.
Okay. Right. But the Japanese do seem to be at an enormous potential disadvantage. I mean, North Korea will need infrastructure. And the Japanese are very good at that. They're very good at, infrastructure building, heavy machinery and so on. By virtue of the fact that Mr. Abe has been maintaining a rather antagonistic relationship with North Korea, does that imply, do you think, that the Chinese and others, the Americans and others, will get first choice when it comes to the infrastructure contracts? And
this is where it gets interesting, right? I mean, do you build a consortium, right, or do you do it by yourself, right? For Japan, it poses a very, very big challenge, right? Because, it basically, is a trigger, right? And it's a 180-degree turn, right, in the way the relationship has been handled in before.
No other questions? I'm sure there must be someone with a question. Well, apart from yourself, and you do describe yourself as a Japan optimist, have you talked to anyone else in Japan, whether they're in industry or business or the government, who shares your view that this is a great opportunity for Japan, or for the region? I mean,
absolutely. Look, yes. I mean, where do I start, right? I mean, let's start with what's that thing called, the GPIF, the public pension system, right? What do I want? I want high-yielding, long-term fixed income assets. Okay, well, if you're building a new port, right, a modern port in some of these new special economic zones, what do you think you get? Right, so public-private partnerships, debt that comes at a high yield, for the Japanese savings glut for the Japanese pension managers, that's a huge opportunity. You've got one of the Japanese trading companies, is very good, right, at sourcing information and being involved, right, on anything that deals with North Korea, and I think that again the potential. To act as a control tower, right? Particularly from the trading companies, is very high. And then for a steel company or for a machinery company to follow in, I mean, from a business perspective, the moment there's a political will, right, to actually go along, right, that the potential for Japan to get its fair share, right, of the $6 trillion investment opportunity, that potential is certainly there.
And you think people recognize that? That's recognized by people you talk to?
I think absolutely. I think the most interesting development was when we had 4 weeks ago the joint meeting with Korea, Japan, and the People's Republic of China leadership here at the Imperial Hotel, that Japan and China signed an agreement to jointly bid for infrastructure development.
Yes.
That's huge. I mean, you could build an Airbus, right? I mean, China builds a Shinkansen, it's perfectly fine. So, who gets to build the chassis? Who gets to build the engine? Who gets to build the thing? This is, I mean, if you want to dream, you can dream. We can have a united Asia, right, built on this North Korean peninsula. Look, now my German colleague gets very... and then we can be sued by the Americans, for colluding.
You mentioned the Choi Hand, and forgive my ignorance on this, but you said it was foreigners the assets of East Germany were put into the Choi Hand, and foreigners were allowed to invest in that, right?
Yeah, it was bidding.
Could that model have some relevance for North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go that way, if you want to completely, again, East Germany was under orders, and there was no question that it was going to follow a capitalist model, right? And so privatization was very, very important, right? So the Treuhand, there were 9,000 industrial complexes, there were 7,500 hotels, there were 1,800 pharmacies, there were, what do I have here, 45,000 establishments and 20,000 commercial enterprises. Only the Germans would, I don't know what is the difference between establishment and commercial enterprise, but, you know, but interesting, basically, you know, in the first 2 years, right, basically 2/3 of the stuff was sold out, right? So it was very, very fast. But again, this is privatization because you and I have grown up in a market economy where private ownership, right, and, you know, the rule of ownership is supposed to be part. In a North Korean special economic zone, just as it was in Shenzhen, right? Even in Shenzhen today, in the special economic zones, it is not clear who owns the land that your factory is operating on, right?
But in Germany, that was all put into the hands. The West Germans were allowed to manage that.
Absolutely.
But that may not be the case in North Korea, presumably.
Absolutely. Well, it's a different system, right?
Okay. All right. Well, that's final opportunity. Anyone to ask a question? If not, oh yes, please go ahead.
You asking about the World Cup, right?
What wonders, what I'm wondering is Mr. Abe, in one side, he is a great strategist. If you think about new Indo-Pacific and what his opportunities is, but on the other side, he is a very conservative, nationalist thinking leader, and this plays a great role in his dealing with North Korea.
Yep.
So both sides from Abe will come together.
Yep.
Which side will win?
This is a huge clash, right? And you're exactly right. I mean, you know, they in the Kante, they seriously think, right, that if you can get a deal on the Lachimondai, on the abductee problem, that your popularity is going to go up by 5 points, right? Now, okay, we're talking about much bigger issues here, right? I personally believe that, you know, that this conundrum, right? One of the ways that that conundrum is going to be solved is that I believe that, and I do not know, obviously, I don't think anybody knows what's in this communique or not. But, you know, let us, you know, if this is correct and we are moving towards a peace treaty, right, that I believe that the direct consequence of that will be that Japan will raise its defense spending, right, from 1% to 2% of GDP, right? I think that becomes very, very immediate, right? Which works for Mr. Trump very well because, you know, assuming, I mean, that's basically $50 billion, right? And a fair share of that stuff is going to come from the United States. The bilateral deficit is about $50 billion. I mean, it's a bit simplistic, but we're dealing with politicians, right? So I think, you know, it's a very unholy tension, right, that you actually have. I also think it will make easier the whole constitutional revision thing. But that's my personal opinion, right? Because yes, America has generated the breakthrough, but now basically the trajectory of where America is going to be in Asia over the next decade is very clear, right? So you're going to have to step up on your own.
Sorry, the trajectory is very clear. What is that trajectory?
The trajectory that, American military presence in Asia Pacific is going to be withdrawn. I mean, if this goes on this way.
Okay. Finally, very, very quickly then, is there a case actually for investing in the Komatsus of this world or the Mitsubishi Heavies or in, in Hyundai or other Korean companies on the off chance that they are going to get some very juicy contracts in the not too distant future out of North Korea? I
think, well, look, I mean, I think it's very interesting when you when you sit down with global investors and you know what are the trends outside of the short-term noise, right? What are the trends that you can believe in, right? And you know, number one, infrastructure investment, right, across Asia is, you know, on fire. And these are credible programs, whether it's China with One Belt, One Road, you know, whatever Mr. Abe is going to do, right, with, you know, what is it called, Indo-Pacific, the potential for North Korea. The big loser in all of this infrastructure spending is going to be Europe, right? Because there's nothing happening. There's no infrastructure development. There's nothing remotely similar to a One Belt, One Road you know, program in the European community. But of course the trains are very good, at least in Germany and Switzerland.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you very much. Last round, last call for questions? No. All right, well, Jesper, thank you very much again for coming along at very short notice. I'm sure this is going to be a running story, so we'll probably be inviting you back again.
Greatest opportunity.
Before long. In the meantime, let me renew your 1-year honorary membership of the club, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.